Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we're going to have a look at Trazyn, also known as the Infinite, a rather peculiar, or perhaps it would be better to say, eccentric Necron overlord. He has himself, you see, a bit of a hobby, a bit of a unique one. Most Necrons view the other various lesser species of the galaxy as little more than fodder at worst and curiosities at best. Trazyn, however, takes that whole curiosity thing to an absolute extreme, to the point where he has started collecting the various minor species of the galaxy, and once he got sick of that, he started collecting them with certain themes. For example, he might not be interested in collecting a orc. He already has an orc. In fact, he has pretty much thousands of orcs. No. It'd be far more interesting to collect them around certain themes, like, for example, Blood Axe's orcs, or orcs that hail from the planet of Gorkamorka, or perhaps a particular sub-faction on Gorkamorka, like a certain Gretchen committee, for example. He also likes to theme his collections around certain famous events, like a major battle perhaps, or a historical turning point, the signing of a major treaty, something along those lines, and of course, he prefers to utilize the original components wherever possible. And bear in mind, he doesn't do this for himself. This is no mere selfish obsession or anything, no. This is, in every possible meaning of the word, an entirely selfless endeavor. Trazyn views himself as an archivist, as a preserver of history. He's not particularly interested in making history, or really even influencing history beyond a couple of minor events that might have threatened his collection, but he is primarily interested in preserving the actions and the historical realities of the 40k universe. He is, essentially, a collector, just like everybody else who paints the miniatures, so you can't really judge Trazyn. He's simply doing what all of us enjoy doing, except on a slightly grander scale. And up until this point, he has been able to archive the various events of the universe relatively peacefully, allowing others to do most of his work for him, because after all, he understands that his nature might invoke certain feelings of anger, possibly, from those who simply do not understand why he is carrying out these obviously rightful actions. He is an archivist, and yet others keep calling him a mass murderer, a torturer, a prison warden, and all of these horrible things that obviously have no real basis in reality, obviously. But unfortunately, recent events have thrown the galaxy into a fair bit of turmoil, which has had the rather unfortunate effect of somewhat complicating Trazyn's philanthropic work. This has led the unfortunate Archivist to repeatedly have no choice but to take more direct actions to ensure that the treasures and artifacts of history not be lost to these unfortunately somewhat tumultuous times. And whilst he himself is of course loathed to do so, in the name of preserving things for posterity, he has had to launch multiple military campaigns over the last few decades. He has also had to take a far more personal approach to certain things, although he quickly realized that those who, again, did not entirely understand his noble goal might find it within their hearts to try and murder him. Preposterous, I know, but then again, who can ever truly understand the lesser minds of the galaxy? Obviously, getting murdered would rather severely impede upon Trazyn's goal of archiving everything and anything of importance that has happened within the galaxy, and so he has taken steps to ensure that his death will be put off for as long as possible. He has developed a network of Lich Guards and lesser Necron Lords to act on his behalf as doppelgangers of sorts, utilizing these agents to get a bit of a read on the mood, to figure out if he's welcome or not, and the overwhelming majority of the time, it is not. Unfortunately, as previously mentioned, there are very few creatures in the galaxy that truly value Trazyn's actions, or hell, even understands or tolerates them. It is an unfortunate reality that most of the lesser petty races of the galaxy have a nasty habit of clinging on to their artifacts. And for what reason, honestly? They could utilize them for what, a few thousand years, perhaps a blink of an eye, essentially, as far as the Necron is concerned. Why not instead offer them up to Trazyn, so that he could include them in his collection and preserve them for eternity? After all, why truly cling on to them for the merest blink of an eye when they could be preserved for all eternity? Surely the choice should be obvious. And yet, time and time again, Trazyn finds himself forced to take more direct and frankly barbarous and savage actions to ensure that these lesser beings don't squander their potentials, the things they have created. For whilst Trazyn is obviously grateful for them, for the creation of these artifacts and these events that he values so much, they simply must understand that it is not their place to keep and control them for all eternity. Though, it must be pointed out that Trazyn is not so uncouth as to simply take something the moment it is created. Of course not. If he did so, he would deny the artifact or the event its true significance. Wherever possible, he would like to trim the edges of history just a little bit here and there to preserve the essence, rather than necessarily the core of these events. After all, it would be much better to take these things and include them in his collection when they have truly grown to fully encompass their potential. For example, let us say there has been a particularly pivotal battle. Trazyn would of course prefer to get everybody involved and be able to recreate the whole thing, but he understands that doing so would probably mess up the timeline of future events ever so slightly. As such, he will content himself with picking off a few things here and there to represent the true meaning of the battle, rather than it in its full scope. Let us, for example, say that there were 7 Imperial Guard regiments involved in this particular engagement. He would take a few dozen from each regiment, maybe a piece of equipment here and there, an armoured vehicle or two perhaps, maybe a flyer, these things to add a little bit of gravitas and detail to the final scenario. Then he would place all of these things within his stasis tombs and lock them for all eternity, or at the very least, until he finds some reason to alter the composition of the piece. Of course, after enough time has passed, he might find it necessary to increase the scale of his collection. Unfortunately, the lives of the lesser species all too often are far too brief, making it very difficult to acquire original components. However, in times of need, even the devil ate flies. As such, Trazyn will happily compromise on certain things. For example, he might not be able to get a specimen of the 533rd Valhallan Regiment who was alive and participating in a particular battle. In such cases, he will simply make do with another member of the regiment, or if the regiment has been wiped out, which would truly be a tragedy, he will also make do with any other Valhallan. He will do so mournfully, of course, but, of course, the needs of historical perseverance occasionally needs to take precedence over his own personal perfectionism. After all, it is far more important to truly capture the spirit and the impact of events rather than get too bogged down in details. For example, his Death of Lord Solar Macarius gallery is populated by several Imperial Guardsmen who are, to put it extraordinarily mildly, incorrect. Unfortunately, his collection has suffered several setbacks over the period of his lengthy lifetime, including a few firefights and some major collapses of his various archives, which has forced him to, on more than one occasion, compromise on historical accuracy. But once again, the vagaries of time and the fact that his work is not appreciated anywhere near enough as it should be forces him to make a few compromises here and there so that he can still fulfill his wider and more important vision of capturing at the very least the essence of these events. And speaking of complications, since Trazyn has been forced over the decades to take a bit more of a direct approach to ensure the safety and continued prosperity of this collection, he has been forced to conduct himself in a manner somewhat more overt than he would prefer. This has drawn a great deal of unwanted attention down upon himself. There was that one time when a particularly inquisitive inquisitor broke into his tomb world and caused an absolutely tragic amount of irreparable damage to many of his favourite collections. Trazyn understands this, he's not an idiot, he gets it. If he wanders out into the galaxy and takes things, then the lesser races might find themselves aggravated by this, because of course they again cannot understand the true grand nature of his vision. He understands. He doesn't blame them for it, but he will punish them whenever he can, because, spare the rod, spoil the child and all that. And with this in mind, he has begun marshalling his legions in even greater numbers. He is, after all, a Necron overlord. He commands tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of loyal Necron warriors. Granted, his efforts of marshalling his troops were inconvenienced of late during the 13th Black Crusade, where one of his artifacts, a minor trinket he had acquired mostly because he thought it looked fancy, caused him considerably more problems than it was worth. You see, he had picked up a certain artifact. The Bell of Saint Gestal, an imperial artifact, a massive bell that had been attempted destroyed by the Black Legion on one of their many Black Crusades. Apparently, the bell could foretell the coming of a Black Crusade, and it did so now, but with some unfortunate side effects. The bell started to ring, despite the fact that it was locked within a chamber that should have entirely cancelled out the effect of time, vibration, sound, and, well, literally anything and everything else. There was absolutely no way in which the bell could actually do what it was now so heartily doing. It tolled 13 times. With every ring of the bell, a greater catastrophe took place in Trazyn's tomb world. In fact, just by the second ring, it sent all of his mighty legions back into stasis slumber. By the time of the third ring, it was actively destroying the architecture of his tomb world. Over the course of its 13 dingalings, it had done more damage to Trazyn's home than any other event in history. Unsurprisingly, Trazyn decided that this thing was most definitively not worth keeping, and simply tossed it off into the webway, where undoubtedly some unlucky Eldar would pick it up and be very, very sad indeed. Meanwhile, Trazyn, somewhat bemused at the fact that the bell had destroyed half of his sanctuary, decided to figure out exactly why it had destroyed half of his sanctuary, because the information seemed like it might be useful for future reference. Thusly, he had to do something he loathed, namely leave his homeworld in person. No proxies, no cat's paws. Trazyn himself had to wander out and figure out precisely what had destroyed half his sanctuary because, well, half his sanctuary had been destroyed. And the overwhelming majority of his Necron legions had been shut down, so no matter how much he disliked it, it was time to take things into his own, two cold, undead mechanical hands. Fortuitously, it wasn't too difficult for him to figure out precisely what had pissed so mightily all over his parade. It was the 13th Black Crusade. The hint was in the number of dings. Additionally, it was a rather obvious event to those in Trazyn's circles. He already possessed several seers in his collection, and several more names that he could go to for guidance. It didn't take him long to figure out Abaddon's goal. It had to, after all, be Cadia for the umpteenth millionth time, and so when he arrived, Trazyn was already there, looking in on things, seeing what was exactly going on. He did figure out Abaddon's plan to shut down the network, keeping the Eye of Terror in check, a network originally constructed by the Necrons. He successfully aided the Imperium in the task of maintaining the network, but he had underestimated just how much of a sore loser Abaddon actually was, as he decided to crash his Blackstone fortress directly into the planet. Now, whether or not that was really a particularly good trade, well, I mean, it did destroy Cadia, so That's good. It fucked over the Necron network, that was also good, and thusly allowed the Eye of Terror to grow uncontrollably across the galaxy, eventually splitting it in two with the Great Rift. On the other hand, Abaddon had just sacrificed a Blackstone fortress to do so. A single Blackstone fortress is worth as much as an entire capital ship fleet. And the loss of said ship brought Abaddon's further conquest to a screeching halt, so I'm not entirely convinced. But on the bright side, it had given Trazyn something new to document, and he had been delivered on a silver platter, essentially, the masterpiece, the key figure for his brand new collection. The Fall of Cadia, starring Ursaker E. Creed in the leading role. Unfortunately, he was unable to also secure his favoured bannerman, but, well, details. And at least he had been able to salvage something from this whole debacle. Despite this all, his collection had been set back many decades, if not centuries. You must remember also that not only did the bell fuck over his home rather savagely, it also broke open several exhibitions. And when you consider the fact that Trazyn at one point had an entire hive fleet as a part of one exhibition, you can imagine just how much additional damage might be caused by some of them being ruptured. If it weren't for the fact that Games Workshop decided to skip forward in a rather considerable way with the Indomitus Crusade, that poor Trazyn would still be dealing with the aftermath of that godforsaken bell. But since they did, Trazyn is probably already finished dealing with most of the fallout. And what a galaxy he can now return to. There has been many interesting battles that have taken place since the fall of Cadia. Not to mention, he's going to have to go and find some more pieces of Cadia, which is going to be interesting considering it is now essentially a part of the Eye of Terror. Not to mention the Necron network of pylons that had kept Chaos in check for so long. Ooh, now that might be very interesting indeed. And then there was that creepy little tech priest, Belisarius Crawl, who had been doing a lot of interesting stuff as well, the Primaris Marines. Ah, yes, Trazyn can smell a few troubles on those little lads. They are undoubtedly going to cause quite a lot of havoc in the immediate future when they inevitably turn to good old-fashioned chaos. And then there's the return of Rowboat Girly Man. That is undoubtedly worthy of a place within his museum, not to mention the fact that he seems to have started transforming the Imperium into something quite different from the stagnant entity that it once was. The bell might certainly have set Trazyn back quite the bit of time, but at the same time, it also heralded a new beginning, and a vast new amount of interesting curiosities for him to collect. I'm sure Trazyn himself doesn't quite know whether he should be thankful to that infernal device, or curse it even further. I'm sure we will find out as the story eventually grinds on for poor old Trazyn. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.